Hello, my name is Rob Garner. I'm a computer programming instructor, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to use structs in C++. So I'm going to create a new project. And we're creating just an empty console application. So we have our start for a typical program with a library. We'll put our functions here, and we'll put our function prototypes here. And so what we want to do is we want to define a struct. And let's say we're defining a struct to store information about some books in our library. Well, what do we want to record for our books? So where do you create a struct? The first place, so the place you do that is in your .h file typically. It's not really a variable declaration. It's declaring a type essentially. So we use the struct keyword, and then we give it a name, an identifier. In this case, we're going to call it books. And then we're going to decide what do we want to store for our books. Well, we probably want the title of the book, and that would best be stored as a string. And then we'd want the author and again is a string, and then the subject, and I'm going to use a string for that as well. And then we're going to want an int for book ID perhaps. And so here we have our struct. We had to include string so that it recognized the string type. And realize this is not a variable declaration, and it's not a function declaration. It's a definition of a struct. And struct is going to be basically a type that we can use later on. You can kind of think of a struct as a container of information. Now, let's see if we can declare one of our structs. And where do you declare your structs? Well, that can be either in a function, that might be in your function library, or it could also be in main. Wherever you would need, just like you would decide where you want to create a variable, you declare the variable basically where you're going to use it. To declare a variable of the type books, then you would, again, you would just declare where you're going to use it. So let's, in main, create 2 books. And of course, doesn't know what a books is in main because we haven't included our .h yet. And just because we might use it here in our functions, I'm going to go ahead and add that include in my functions as well. So now we can see that we created this struct here, and we have this, now we have these 2 variables, book 1 and book 2, created from this struct. And let's make our book 1. And the key to using a struct is this dot operator. You'll notice that my IntelliSense in Visual Studio brings up a list of what's available for book 1, and we can see we have author, book ID, subject, and title. So I'm going to say title is equal to and we can see here now we've assigned the string into the title element of our book 1. So we now have a book 1. It's got a title, an author, or subject, and a book ID, and it has this data stored in book 1. Similarly, we can make a book 2. And notice when I'm typing these things, as soon as I have IntelliSense showing me the element I want, I can just hit tab and it's called tab completion. It will finish it out so I can type faster. Great, now we've got 2 books. And let's say the next thing we want to do is we want to display what's in those books. Maybe we'll put some comments in here. And so here, in order to assign things into our book, we basically just did an assignment operation. And the way you should probably think of the identifier for this title for book 1 is the whole name, book1.title. So if I want to print book1.title here, it's the same sort of thing. And then let's say I also want, so I'm going to run that. And okay, we're displaying the information, but it's all in one line. I probably need some ENDLs here. And we can see we have, in fact, stored information into book 1 in each of these elements, and then we can retrieve them. So that's neat, but we could do that with variables. Why are structs so useful? Well, they create a compact way of storing this information. So let's say, I wanted to display the book 2. And you'll notice that, we're doing a lot of repetition here. And so we have the 2 books, they're being displayed. But we're having to repeat this stuff a lot. And it'd be nice to extract this out perhaps in a function. So I'm going to take this part here, and I'm going to create a function. And if I was going to show book info, we would have to, if we're doing this without structs, we'd have to have a parameter for title, for author, for subject, and book ID, and you'd have a string title, string author. You'd be writing a lot of parameters there. Here, because we have this struct, think of this struct as basically just holding a packet of information. We can just say this, just pass in a book, and it will work with this. And here now we can use that parameter, and because of the dot, you can see here we have this function we pass in a book, and it can extract out of that book each of the elements in the book without having to have a long parameter list. So this is much easier to use once we have the struct to pass information around, because we only have to pass one thing rather than 4 things. And imagine if you have 30 elements describing this book. It'd be nice to not have to write 30 parameters. This makes it much simpler. Once we have our new function, of course, we need the function prototype in our .h file. And now with to display the book here, we can just use our function. Similarly here for book 2. Our book now has a function. We create a couple of books. We pass them to this this function, and then the function will display the information. Let's see if that works. And yes, in fact, it does work. Similarly, maybe we could make this creation part be a function. So we'll maybe create a function called and so we want to input into our book here. So it's just like any other variable. You can, for example, we're going to use a get line here. We could get line and say, and just input directly into our struct, just like any other variable. And so here we have our title. We'll do the same thing for author. and subject. And for our ID, since it's an int, we're going to use just, we'll just CN directly into book ID. Of course, since we're using a CN, we're going to do a cn.ignore to clear out the buffer at the end of this function. And then we'll return this book. So you can see this is just like any other ask function. We're going to ask the user to provide some information. We declare an object to hold the information. In this case, though, we're going to get 4 pieces of information and store it in one item, one object called book, and we'll just pass the book back as one item. And so now that we have that, we can create our driver. In our driver, we'll make this a little bit more flexible. We'll just say we're going to ask the user for book 1. And we'll use our function. Of course, I've got to copy my function prototype over. We can do the same thing for book 2. And so we're going to use this function twice to get information from the user on book 1 and book 2, and then we'll display the information. Get the second book. And now we can see we can get a book in, and we can send a book out. And basically we now have this container that can contain multiple elements for one variable, and it makes it a little easier to pass information around from one function to another. And note that the pattern is kind of the same thing. You have an ask function to get information from the user. In main, you create some variables to hold the information, and then you pass that information to another function to use it. So what's the next thing we could do? Well, let's say that we wanted to make this so that we could get multiple books and store them as a collection. Well, what we would do then is maybe we make in main a collection of books. So rather than just having one book, could we create a vector of books? Something like this. So we can declare we're going to have our library variable hold a collection of books. And then what we'll do is we will do a while loop. Or we'll use a do while loop. And we'll use our ask function here to get a book from the user. And then we'll just add it to our library. Okay, so it looks like we're getting information in, and then we'll do a for loop. And of course we go from I is less than whatever size our library is, which is a vector. So it's got a size function that returns the number of elements in the library. And we'll just, we got our nice little show book info function. And what are we going to pass it? We need to pass a book. Which book do we want? We're going to use our library. And of course, we need to provide an index for the one we want, which will be using I. So this will loop through all of the books in our library. We'll grab each one by one by using the index function. You could also use .at. You could do this as well. That and this are of course the same thing. And so we'll pass in the index of the one we want. We'll go through each one from 0 to the size of the vector for the library. And then we'll just pass that to our show book and it will display it. So let's see if that works. And we can see we're able to get some inputs from the user, put them into a collection of books, and then display them. So here now we're seeing that we can use, and it's really your struct is being used just like any other type. If this is a collection of ints and your ask function was just please enter an int, you would have a collection of numbers. But with our struct, we're basically just saying we want our information to be structured this way. It's going to have, each element is going to have and then it kind of makes a table if you think about it. If you were to display this as a table, this information would be, in columns and rows. In fact, maybe we could do that. Let's change our book function. Rather than display it this way, maybe we could display it as a table. So we're going to go change book info. We'll make this into a column format. Of course, I have to include the IO manip library. So we'll start off with maybe 30 elements. We'll see how, maybe this one doesn't need to be that big. And we'll change this so that we're going to get a vector of books. And we will use we're going to take this piece of code in here and And so how do we get each of these books? It's coming in here as a vector of books, and we're looping through here. Maybe what we'll do is we'll break it down a little bit more here. We'll say book is equal to books So in order to get a single book out of our vector, we'll use the index to get that book out, and then we can use its .title.author. You could also put books 1, books 2, books 3 in here, and this might be confusing to you because the lower class variable name is similar to class name. I'm going to rename this to maybe we'll reuse library because that makes more sense. If you hit Control-R twice, you can do a refactor rename, which is kind of nice because if you want to rename a variable, it will do that. So here we can, maybe this makes it easier to see. We're bringing in our library. We're going to loop through all the books in our library. We'll get one book out of the library and then display its information. And we'll use the set W to kind of set up in the column. And then down back here in main, we will just call that new function. Of course, we need to make sure that once we change a function, we go back and change its prototype just by copying and pasting. And I recommend never typing in the stuff for the function prototype in .h. Just copy and paste it, and it'll make sure that you don't get any spelling errors. And then here we'll just call so we're going to call show book information. We're going to pass in our library. Since it takes a vector of books, that's what we're going to pass in. And we have a table. Not a great looking table. We could probably keep working on it, but you can see this illustrates that a vector of structs really corresponds to a table of information. And this completes my demonstration. Thank you very much.